I have a whole thought catalog of things to get into, so I'm just wondering in what order to go in. So let me just finish off my last recording and go back and repair some things, because right at the end I said some things about myself, about my own case, and now I have mulled that over and reprocessed that slightly. I think that I am wrong that my false ego complex was a sinless false ego. I don't think it is a sinless false ego. I think that it is as fallen as all the other ones. And in some sense, the conclusion that I came to, the false conclusion that I came to at the end of the last recording, was that, oh, well, being envious of the only begotten Son and being envious of the self-realized understanding, in a true religious concept, being envious of it, and the formulation of that envy is that I'm going to construct it out of the false ego. I'm trying to work out how to bridge it from the false ego to the self-realization. That was in fact not the prime directive of my prime death. That was a secondary chain that was very close to the core, but it was like a secondary sort of chain or something like that. Like I don't think it was on the side of life. I think it was on the side of the knowledge, tree of the knowledge of the fruit of good and evil, in some sense, of eating of that fruit. And then I kind of, part of then also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was positioning that conclusion as being on the side of life. That was in some sense part of the development of my false ego complex. And in the context of my last recording, I think this all makes perfect sense. So essentially, I recoded that belief. That belief was a very young conclusion in the chain of associative thinking that compiled the false ego complex after the prime death. But then that component in the chain was then repositioned epistemologically. It was as the false epistemology that the false ego complex represents. It aberrated the ontological chronology, in essence. It fiddled with the ontological baseline in some sense, and this is how, this is why I've always said it's so important, I think, that when you're looking at the false ego complex, to understand that you're dealing with two sets of books, as it were, two sets of accountings, two sets of records, that there's an ontological and there's an epistemological structure. And I do think that in some sense, almost in this example, you have to deal with the one and then deal with the other and then deal back again with the one and deal with the other, as the one is unlocking the other to go deeper and deeper, and then you eventually find sort of the prime confusion, the prime concocted cross wiring that kind of creates a sediment, creates a kind of a resonant mix-up of the ontology and the epistemology to then create this kind of a medium that's capable of supporting the self-delusion that the false ego complex entails, therefore. But essentially there's a prime mix-up between the ontology and the epistemology, which is even compounded by the fact, it's problematically compounded by the fact that the false prophet, that floating parent function in the superego, doesn't have a dominant function behind it to structure it. Or if it does have something of a semblance of a dominant function, it comes with the semblance of a child function. And between those two semblances, because they are unfinished and nebulous in their character, they can contrive and weave any number of potential permutation and reevaluation, blah, blah, blah. And in some sense, I think by having a structured dominant function in the superego, which is eventually, I think, only established via the ego, that the ego can reach above itself, through itself, taking upon itself its own weight of the structures of the false ego complex, so keeping it inside the self, keeping responsibility for it, that then it can reach up, and then it can properly structure the dominant function in the superego, and then in some sense, the child function of the superego does not have a structure, but that is in some sense becomes an unlocked expression of free theta. It becomes an unlocked, perhaps, the tone arm from the ego function expands into that. So the tone arm grows into that would-be child function, but it stays unstructured. It stays as free theta. So that, I think, might also be the kind of the harmony that surrounds, or even in some sense a representation of, let's say, the eminence of the Holy Ghost re-established, sort of ensconcing, encapsulating the New Jerusalem, which is like the dominant function in the superego. So the New Jerusalem then creates this atmosphere of this expanded, liberated, free theta. Anyway, so that's a bit of an expansion, but also using myself as an example of the false ego complex, is that in some sense it is, I think, very useful to try find exactly the mix-up between the ontological and epistemological, which in some sense kind of is only revealed once you've reached a certain level of sort of integration, and then you actually work out what the prime crosswire was, crosswiring, that then was sort of the pattern of all your other sort of self-deception that is baked into all the other structures. And so then you're kind of capable of really keying yourself out, or unplugging yourself from the false ego complex. Or at least, discharging the toxicity of the subconscious is how I kind of phrased it before in the last thing. Now, I don't know if I want to just move into the next subject, or if I should make a separate recording, although it's going to be weird just to have this at the beginning of another whole different topic. Let me see. So, I mean, I've been talking to, I guess I will just move into the topic. So, I have been talking to a whole lot of different people. One person in their young 20s, another person in their late 20s, men, and, you know, it's a very interesting mix in some sense. One is an ENFP in MBTI language, another one is an ENTP, and, you know, and I also had a very interesting, just random discussion with other people, talking about who in society is prone to being corrupted by society, like which types in society are prone to, in some sense, becoming evil, in some sense, becoming corrupted in some sense because of the environmental impact of culture, which was a very interesting question. I thought I even misunderstood the question when I first heard it, because I was like, are you saying, I mean, this is so tangential, maybe it's not interesting, but I'll just relate anyway. Like I misunderstood the question, because I was thinking, are you asking who gets misled by corrupt people in a society? Like who becomes the unwitting follower of a corrupt leader who is, let's say, who is just who puts on a good front, who's a good ringleader, but they actually know what they're doing is just social manipulation? Or are you saying, like, who goes along with it? And we got some very, very interesting discussion around that. I would like to say that I was capable of describing all of this myself, but because I think I did kind of shoehorn us towards these sorts of directions, and then other people explored it, which was great inspiration for me as well. But I guess I cannot, as I just tried to, perhaps I cannot claim mastery of all the content that came up in this very interesting discussion, because I must say I wouldn't have thought about the sensory types, and they brought out the sensory types, which I was thinking about quite heavily as well. But, you know, so we were discussing ESFJs, ENFPs, and I mean, and ENTPs as well. But although I don't think ENTP is the correct answer to the question as it was asked, because the question that was asked was who actually is made corrupt by their cultural environment in some sense, which types are prone to becoming corrupt because of a cultural influence. And in some sense, ENTP, I mean, is a controversial answer to this question, I would say, at the very least. I would say that ENTPs cannot claim to be corrupted by their culture, because I think that they do it to themselves. Like, they know that they're taking a shortcut. in some sense, they know that they're kind of tailoring their thinking in order to kind of, in some sense, it becomes a kind of obtuse, indirect form of misdirected context mongering. And in some sense, they are, it's a form of social manipulation, but they do it out of a kind of paternity. They say, well, you know, nothing would happen unless I just kind of set us toward that goal, unless I kind of shoehorn and kind of gesture by let's say manipulating the intellectual context of the subject matter. In some sense, this has a lot to do with extroverted intuition being their primary function, because extroverted intuition, especially with the problem with ENTPs is really their extroverted thinking, because their extroverted thinking, because they have FI trickster, their extroverted thinking is devoid of morality. The only way for their extroverted thinking to be properly, to have enough morality in it, is if it properly sublimates FI. FI, and even within my system, I respect this, at least this aspect of cognitive axes, and you know, the theory around cognitive axes doesn't work in a lot of ways, but it certainly does with FI and TI. Sorry, FI and TE, extroverted thinking. Because extroverted thinking, there's only one extroverted thinking in my model. There are three introverted thinkings in my model, and there are two introverted feelings in my model, and one of them is more robust than the other one. The one that's more basic is actually much more important in some senses. It almost is what the spirit is itself. Anyway, that then FI is very dangerous in some sense, in the sense that other FI users that don't like TE, that's also what makes them prone to amorality, I would say, as well. Anyway, I don't know if I want to talk, I'm getting into the specifics before I lay out all the generalities around this interesting topic. Maybe I should have headlined where I'm going with this as well. But, I mean, I'm roughly getting into describing Keegan stage 3. What I have now roughly called Keegan stage 3.5 and Keegan stage 4.5, because I think that Keegan stage 4.5 is an actual thing that people know about, but I think that it actually, there's no such thing as Keegan stage 4.5 without a corresponding sort of cultural manifestation or organizational template and blueprint, and let's say manifested belief structure, which I'm roughly calling Keegan stage 3.5, that it's kind of like the conventional structure that undergirds a Keegan stage 4.5, which is a kind of apathy, a kind of nihilism in some sense. Nihilism is perhaps the wrong word as well, because I would say it's usually a compartmentalized amoralism. Because to be nihilistic, you have to be completely, let's say, apathetic on the entire subject of morality, where I think Keegan stage 4.5, and maybe I'm expanding it because I've never read Keegan's book or whatever, maybe I'm expanding the concept slightly, but I think Keegan stage 4.5 is more about arbitrary compartmentalization, which doesn't seem arbitrary to the person doing it, because they have been given the green light. They have made their own excuses for themselves, and it like makes sense in their bubble reality, which they don't want popped by other people. And if anyone threatens popping that bubble, then those people are get projected onto as being narcissistic. And there's this very deep correlation between borderline and narcissism, because in some sense the one is the shadow reflection of the other. And so if you are part of, let's say, a borderline cult, you are going to say that the people that don't agree with you are evil narcissists. And in some sense, this is a bit of a perennial problem in some sense, because even people that, let's say, aren't borderline and cultish, although I say that a bit tongue-in-cheek, because in some sense I do think that in some sense you can't have any kind of organization or any kind of group without some kind of shared good faith. And what makes it good in some sense is something that has to be hashed out, something that has to be justifiable in persuasive. You need to be able to come to terms with people. You need to be able to negotiate this out, and maybe do it in an amicable sort of way. But if you've got sort of hard and fast rules that say, no, actually we've got an emergency right now, we don't have time to hash this out carefully, So we have to actually be uncareful. I've given myself the excuse to be uncareful, and the type of intellectual inquiry that you're trying to do is too not necessary. It's too, it's not part of the zeitgeist that I'm being husked away by, that I in my bandwagon and in my train of necessity. It's not important right now. We've got an emergency to handle, please, thank you. So there's always a kind of excuse like that, and in the realm of the intellect, this is why it's so important. Or I mean, in some sense, this is why, if you don't get along with people, you should perhaps exclude them. You should perhaps oust them. You should, people should have boundaries in some sense. And then, maybe that's because there isn't a bridge between these two disparate faiths in some sense. But maybe you need time apart so that you can each develop some cross communication, perhaps, so that the one party can maybe open up the issue by creating an invitation or a public offer, by saying, well, this is the problem that I have with your way of life. So you the one may be trying to secretly keep track of the other one and try to kind of gesture some model of what the defect in the other person's faith is, so that they can perhaps get into a position where they're willing to hash it out or negotiate or something like that, or come. I mean, compromise is not always good. It's not always good to compromise. Sometimes if you don't have the ingredients to have a dignified, integrity-based compromise, then don't have a compromise. Maybe you need to separate and specialize before there can be a compromise. But that's also problematic, because in some sense, if the other person really does think that they have the answer to what the other person is going on, you would hope to think that they would hear them out. But, and when people are unserious enough that they're not willing to hear the other person out, they would prefer, and in some sense, people can be quite treacherous in this way, because they can say, I don't want the schism, you want the schism, because you won't just believe the narrative, or you won't just accept the simple truth that I'm telling you, because it's actually just too simple and you're trying to make it too complicated. And then you get these labels. Oh, it says in the Bible, don't argue about words, don't argue about semantics. You're arguing about semantics. And it's like, well, maybe it appears to you that I'm arguing about semantics, but that is how I'm trying to treat the underlying fundamental problem, which you are literally, you're deaf to me. You're setting out these arbitrary obstacles that my contribution has to navigate before, and you're not willing to co-chair this discussion, this meta discussion. And in some sense, a lot of people that are frankly not even capable of co-chairing any kind of meta discussion at all, because their beliefs are abjectly profane. They are abjectly allergic to any kind of duplicated understanding, because they actually say, no, you can't actually understand. You don't have the same lived experience. It's impossible. You don't know what empathy is. Empathy is not possible with people that are of a different kind, of this kind, or something like that. So you get these very kind of and sometimes empathy might in practice not be possible between those groups of people, because those groups of people actually need more people within them before they can be integrated and synthesized well enough that then they're capable of expanding their awareness. So in some sense, there is a thing to like a gradient scale of let's say opening your awareness. But in some sense, I do want to get people past this point of assuming that just because something doesn't sound positive and kind and isn't treating them with enough positivity and kindness, that in some sense axiomatically that they don't have everyone's best interests at heart, and they don't have a greater hope that everything does work out in the end. Just because someone has a harsh tone doesn't mean that they don't have the capacity for forgiveness, and I mean a ready capacity for forgiveness, that they aren't in a sense offering some kind of functional edifice that is almost the bootstrap bare requirement for having an honest, authentic exchange that has the possibility of working out problems, as it were. And that's why I keep on going over my 5 values all the time. That, we need to respect each other's negative values more than our positive values, and even try to politely argue about those negative values to try to come into an agreement. Because if you don't have a kind of axiomatic tool set that is shared. You don't have enough shared faith to even be, because in some sense then you'll always just say, well, that's bad faith to me, and I'm acting in good faith, and you have the same position, so therefore we're at an impasse and it can't be resolved. So in some sense you need to be able to discuss what good faith and bad faith is. Now that's fundamentally impossible with people that are somewhat subject to a narrative. Because if they're subject to, let's say, a peculiar narrative, and that is the basis of their understanding, is a peculiar narrative, then essentially their FI is mystified. Their FI is fated. They have a fated understanding. They have an understanding of fatalism. They don't have an understanding that's justifiable, that can be shared. So in some sense, they've got some kind of some part of their story tells them that they're right, and everyone who doesn't agree with them on that point is wrong, and they don't have a method of turning that stone around to look underneath it. They don't want to leave. They've got part of their narrative is an anchor, which is a stone that cannot be turned. They think they've found the philosopher's stone. They think they've found the cornerstone of reality. And I think I've also found the cornerstone of reality, but mine's different, because I will actually pick mine up and look underneath it. I can actually turn mine around. I can justify mine. That's why I'm different, even though I'm also the same as these narcissistic, conceited people. I do have a narcissism, but I'll say that my narcissism is a benign narcissism. There's nothing wrong with narcissism in that sense. So everything is narcissism, like everything is vanity. Everything is vanity. Everything is vanity. So what's the difference between operating and not operating? That you just can't have a vanity at all? No. It doesn't say in the Bible that you stop being vain. It says actually in the description of the Son of God. I mean, I know some people won't take this as an authority, but this is in principle, I think this can't be argued with. The description of the Son of God in the Bible is that not that he will not have vanity, it's that he will not lift his hand up unto vanity, that he will not raise his hands up for vanity. So just think about that. Just raising your hand for vanity. It's just interesting that the Nazi salute is literally raising the hand. But anyway, very different from how the British royal family raised their hands. When they raise their hand, look how do you see how the royals wave? They don't wave from side to side, like as if it was your head nodding from shoulder to shoulder, ear on shoulder to the other ear on shoulder. That's not how they wave. They wave with their hand almost like a Vulcan putting their hand out, and then they rotate it as if it was a head looking, scanning left to right, being vigilant. Their hand is a vigilant owl. I'm somewhat metaphoricalizing this, but in some sense, do you know why the royals wave like that? They wave like that because they do not wish to condescend to their subjects. Because to condescend to their subjects is a vanity. They are waving like that to not be vain. And look at how the Nazis salute. Look at how they raise their hand. That's a collective vanity. That's like our vanity is justified because we share this vanity. We give it sympathetically to our people, to our blood. It's mythologized. Do we understand it, or have we inherited it? And this is the meaning of the scripture when it says, "Flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom." The kingdom of God comes not with observation. What were the Nazis trying to do? They were trying to observe the kingdom of God, and they were raising their hands unto vanity. Anyway, interesting parallels. Let me move on. So, what's my point here? So I was talking about culture and people being corruptible by culture, people becoming evil themselves by sort of cottoning onto a kind of cultural sort of thing. And it was interesting that essentially, because this is something of a bit of a theodicy, this moral question is kind of to do a bit with theodicy, explaining the existence of evil within a religious kind of framework, within a religious moralism. I think within typology you get very deep kind of religious metaphysics and themes. I really like talking to people who are familiar on a deep level and are spiritually connecting in some sense, or having a holistic understanding about cognitive functions, because it is a brilliant way to understand the anatomy of the spirit, and even of the collective souls and the collective karma that we can accumulate between the souls, which is a very, very tricky subject. And I'm going to get into that when I talk later about sexuality as well. But in some sense, I do think that the problem with karma, the problem with the unconscious side of the mind, the problem with metagram circuitry in my own thinking, is that people are too addicted to the melodrama. And in some sense, a good analogy, this is a bit of a crazy analogy, I call them spiritual lesbians. Because in the sense that the spirit is always masculine and the soul is feminine. And the soul properly belongs to God. It doesn't belong to you. It only belongs to, it doesn't even belong to the Son of Man and to the Son of God. It belongs to the Father. And you can try to help the flesh even. But to help the soul is something that is kind of, because you have to be responsible for your own soul, basically. You can't breach that. If you breach that and you try to take on other people's spiritual responsibility, you can be a helper. You can try to help them. But you have to be very careful about the subject of spiritual responsibility, because then you essentially are acting as the surrogate Holy Ghost for somebody else. And in some sense, this is actually what the Holy Spirit refers to, which is actually quite a problematic thing. The Holy Spirit is something like, Holy Spirit, you can say it works around the church. I wouldn't even say the Holy Spirit works within the church in some sense. It works on the spirit of man. The Holy Spirit is a witness to the spirit of man. It's not a witness to your true self-actualized Christ consciousness. So in some sense, it's kind of like anyway, I don't want to get into this topic. I don't want to talk about it from this angle. Let me talk about it from another angle rather. But this is very much like Keegan stage 4.5, 3.5, the spiritual lesbianism in some sense. And when I'm saying spiritual lesbianism, it's a bit of an oxymoron, because spirit, I just said, is masculine, and lesbianism has to do with, well, the feminine has to do with the soul. So if you're a soul that's trying to get along with other souls, and you only cared about the contents of the souls, and somehow you have to have an objective idea of what can be in a soul and what can be transposed between souls and exchanged between souls, that kind of weighing, in some sense, I think, is always a hideous form of corrupt religion, because that is basically trying to say there's this objective reality, there's this objective field, and in some sense, that is what the Father and the Holy Ghost in the Christian doctrine is meant to cater to. The Father and the Holy Ghost they manage that. And in some sense, the Holy Ghost means that you have to understand that there are possibilities, but there are limits to how you can think about possibilities. Because if you don't know the limit of your possibility of using predictability in your mind, you're going to end up invalidating and devaluing, in some sense, other people's free will and responsibility. You're going to break things that are integral to spiritual life. So you have to know the limits of, let's say, your extroverted intuition. You have to respect things well enough to not make extroverted intuition conjectures about them. You know, something like the categorical formulation of the Kantian ethical, sort of thing, that treat people not as an end to a means, as a means to an end, but treat them as an ends in themselves. That's a bit of a rough summary of so it's something like that, but it's, that has to be bound within very particular sets of sort of things. Now, extroverted thinking is below extroverted intuition in my cognitive understanding of the pyramid of cognitive functions. And so extroverted thinking actually needs to have a working model of how other people's responsibilities are are in practice. And it's very hard to grow TE, extroverted thinking models. It's very difficult because the only way to do it responsibly is to properly integrate it with introverted feeling in your understanding, with the right amount of respect of outside authority, the right amount of humility about your own limits, but then also knowing that essentially, you see, like knowing what you don't know, knowing how you don't know it, and knowing what it might be there can kind of also be in a TE model. And in some sense, you have to remember all the axioms and all the caveats that your TE models are built on in the sections of your TE model. And you do have to, I think, try to have one integrated model. Obviously, when you're dealing with a subtopic, you can kind of hone in within that model, but I do think that you need to have one TE fabric, something like maybe the prima materia properly synthesized or synthesizing itself. So there's a continual alchemy with that TE matrix. Matrix is a bit of a strange, usually I use matrix in connection with TI. TI is a much more problematic, finicky sort of thing, because TI is in some sense a frame of reference, a point of view, and points of view are always defective. They are never permanent. So the only way to even deploy them reliably is to, anyway, this is a bit complicated because there's more than one there are 3 TIs in my cognitive function modeling. So it's also a complicated subject. But anyway, the point of me talking about this is that what should I say? So I'm on the subject of people being corruptible because of, let's say, cultural toxicity or culture modeling them a kind of a toxic way of being, and then them going along with it. Yeah, okay, so I was trying to get also into the issue of morality or something like that, and then I started talking about the Trinity in order to kind of escape the problem of a kind of narrative reductionism of life in some sense, which is in some sense the way that you escape solipsism is the Holy Ghost and the Father, and also the way that you escape pantheism, which so many false religious kind of teachings are essentially some form of pantheism, or perennialism as well, in fact. And I know I use the word perennial a lot, but essentially that's is me saying, yes, this is a mystery. Let us now unlock this mystery and get a better understanding, a higher understanding. So these, so I mean, and then the other thing is, in some sense, the way that then you escape also thinking, because basically you are not the Father. You are not the Father in heaven. So stop trying to conceive of reality in the world from that objective point of view. It doesn't belong to you. That objective point of view, in some sense, is what the Father does to your soul. But you still have to reprocess your soul as an experiential, subjective, as an immediate percipient of the soul. You are an immediate percipient of the soul. In some sense, you are even not your soul. You are your understanding. You are your spirit in the soul. That is what you have control over. That is what your free will has to do. So in some sense, you don't get to choose the parameter of your soul, but you get to. It's as if, this is a really good analogy. It's as if you woke up on a ship and all of your memories were wiped out completely, and you have a captain's hat on, and you're in the middle of the ocean on a ship, and there are all these people on the decks of the ship, and they are all doing their job, and you have a captain's hat on, and you're in the sort of, I don't know what it's called, you're in the piloting station or whatever, and you've got a big wheel in front of you, because you actually can change the rudder with that wheel, and you can change the course of the ship. And let's just say, like, you don't know what's going on. You perhaps don't know what you're doing, but you kind of have these vague impressions that wheel is yours, and you start moving it, and then the whole ship kind of moves in some ways, and you work out, oh, I turn the wheel that way and I go that direction, I turn the wheel the other direction, and you go that way. So you can kind of learn that, and then in some sense complicated things start happening, like maybe the wind hits the sails badly, and it's like, well, is that your fault because you went in the wrong direction? Or is the wind just inconsistent sometimes, and that was just like something that you couldn't have anticipated? Like, you have to know quite a lot about the weather and about ships to even be able to judge yourself if you're doing badly or not. Like, are other people upset about this? Are they upset about it because it's a bad omen? Because they actually understand that you're not doing your job right? Or maybe it's not even you. Maybe someone didn't do the sales right, or someone hasn't given the command to do the sales right for this kind of condition. So it's like you have the problem of, is this a freak of nature? Is this a troublesome freak of nature, or is this just is this the normal inconsistency of the nature of the enterprise? Or is there something that you could be doing better, and is there a novel command that you could come up with that would, hey, you put up more sails or take down sails, or, do you know the strength of the mast to hold the sails in whatever condition? So all of these things are sort of augmented by potential knowledge that can be garnered or something like that. And in some sense, you only have yourself to some degree, and that might not be enough. Maybe you need to know the people that you're working with well enough so that you have more eyes and more understanding on what's going on, without people communicating, without people reporting to one another what's going on in a way in which some kind of fidelity and the structure of the structure of the relatability of, in some sense, that you're functioning in a group. And this is the problem of karma, is that karma cannot be in some sense you need to tackle your own karma and distinguish what's on your plate as opposed to other people's problems. But there is something that you learn when you go to a buffet, that in some sense you can't help that you're eating your plate of karma and you need to process what's on your plate, but you're at a public buffet, and maybe other people have tricked you, maybe other people have snuck food on your plate, and then you get confused and you're like, well, I guess I chose this, so I should eat it, otherwise I'm wasting it. But actually somebody else is playing a trick on you, and you don't. That's a bit of a far-fetched example, but that's the kind of the problem with Keegan stage 3.5, is that you often need to have juvenile peers that have a kind of competitive edge to them in some sense, so that you can get sick of it and want to graduate from it, that you can kind of see the bullshit, but then also know that you're also doing some level of that bullshit. And so and that gives you, let's say, the purchase on the nature of the problem to start, because in some sense, if you can't create enough of a boundary between your role and other people's roles in the present moment of your understanding, then you're never going to be able to disassociate yourself from the buffet of the problem, rather than what's on your plate and what's on your plate to process. And this is the kind of juxtaposition, this is the kind of narrative conflation that all kind of proto-fascistic thinking gets into. And I wanted to use sexuality as a good example of this, because there was a very Millennial Woes, who I can't even call a proto-fascist without kind of making that an understatement, but I would class him in my group of intellectuals that I complain about as being proto-fascist, but obviously he would consider himself to be a full-fledged sort of fascist intellectual, perhaps. Or, I mean, in some sense, I think some of his morality and some of his intellectualism does take a little bit of a critical view of fascist society, or that he's wary of it, in that he's wary of the dangers of the enterprise or something like that. I don't think he's wary enough of it. I don't think he realizes just how stupid the whole thing is, and how fatefully pathetic and sort of denigrating the whole thing will always end up being. but in some sense he sees it maybe as a kind of as a halfway house for humanity or something like that, or that it would at least be appropriate for his ilk or something. But the problem, and I'll just put this in a functional sense, and this is a good motif of me critiquing this point about millennial woes, is that he criticized the Taylor Swift song "Me," and I mean it isn't a perfect song. So I mean, obviously it's obviously quite a little bit cringy when the in the turn of phrase in the song "spelling is fun." Is it? But and they always take that part out when they're performing it live. But you know, it's a song of more than two people, so they're only ever going to perform it when there's actually a really proper event. When both of those people should be together on stage at some kind of event, and then they'll just kind of probably repurpose those lines to make them specific lines to do with the event. But there's nothing wrong with that song. In fact, that song is much less degenerate than the other music that there is today that kind of gets people against their own egos and digs them into their subconscious minds, digs them into concocting beliefs to try to kind of narcissistically shield them from bullshit. You know, the idea that that you can be a unique, embodied individual and that there's something special about you. There's nothing wrong about that. In some sense, I mean, Millennial Woes complaining about that song is something of a meta commentary on the degeneration and how susceptible people are in some sense to the kind of the consumer culture of that you need to be bestowed with dignity by your system. Your culture needs to grant you a dispensation of identity because you can't develop one yourself. And Millennial Woes did even explicitly get into this kind of topic. And you realize that that kind of soliloquy, that kind of let's say moralizing and existential sort of excuse making that Millennial Woes was doing there is this disgusting form of like, we need a collective sympathy. We need to be plied with sympathy. Without sympathy, we won't make it. We need to be mainlining sympathy, and we need out groups to distinguish ourselves against, a scapegoat to pay for our sympathy. I mean, it's something that he didn't explicitly say, but I would say is basically built into what he's kind of talking about. And this is because he's basically a borderline ideologue. So he's got a kind of hybridized borderline personality disorder built into the narrative of his way of believing how things function. And in some sense, this is to do with what scientism in some sense, you know. So I mean, he's got his own form of scientism. Just his scientism is the kind of the mythology of ethnic history in Blood and Soil, or some kind of mythology around that. Whereas, you know, so, but in some sense, there's no great difference in character between Millennial Woes and Rationality Rules. There's no great difference between Millennial Woes and Destiny, who's, you know, an identitarian social justice warrior proto-fascist. It's all the same style of narrative. It's all the same, you know, and in some sense, well, then you can just say, well, now I'm just proving the point that it's ubiquitous, that this is a ubiquitous coping mechanism of the feeble-minded, and we need to live in a dream. And I do think we do need to live in a dream. The culture does, to some degree, need to provide some kind of canonical values for people to navigate their life through. And we have lost that dream because some people, at some stages of their life, are not individuals. They are, let's say, dependent on their culture for some model of health, for some model of how to grow up. Because in some sense, we do need to have, at some point, I mean, this is the problem with governance. Governance, in a nutshell, is that, you know, like the old form of Western liberal governance was, in some sense, the abhorrence of unjustified hard power used against the citizenry. We want to have procedural mechanisms that protect the citizenry from the overreach of the hard power of the state. So we say, better to let one innocent man... Sorry, I said it in the wrong order. Better to let 1,000 guilty men go free than to let one innocent man go to jail, is the kind of trade-off that we are willing to do in order to protect the individual from the hard power. So we have that kind of thing in our system, which in some sense doesn't exist in France, because in France you have to prove your innocence. But anyway, and it's, you know, the whole French thing is, they really are in the image of their revolution, because in some sense, you know, like, this is why they're so, you know, because the culture itself polices, the culture itself is in some sense the final arbiter, which is a bit too collectivist in my view, in some sense. Like, yes, they have, there is room in that collectivism to have, let's say, radical intellectual elites that are like very, let's say, subversive. You know, the French enjoy that because that means that they're part of a sophisticated system. But the problem with that is that you kind of, you're stuck in this kind of lowest common denominator, and you can't break the mold of that sort of idea that, well, if it's not to be assimilated generally into culture, then it's a strange judge in some sense. Like, it's better to actually work out where the line should be drawn, where the government should actually say to someone, no, you've gone to. I mean, I had a very interesting discussion with someone who wanted a basic income grant, and I basically explained all the problems with the basic income grant, because in theory it's better than a welfare state. In theory it's much better than a lot of things. The problem is that it expects people to take responsibility for their own lives. And I do think that when you double down on being more sympathetic to people, it might be a more benign form of sympathy than other forms of government benefits and assistance. But in some sense, in its across-the-board application, it ends up creating and perhaps even perversely incentivizing new forms of even more degenerate evilness in some sense, because there will be some people that will find ways to take advantage of it, and you have to structure it in such a way that the government will end up either by positive impact or by negative decree, by actually saying, no, there are limits to basic income. We will not give you a basic, we will retract, I do actually think that if you did have a basic income grant, you would have to have a mechanism in which you would actually say, you, for moral reasons, only for moral reasons of the individual, you have disqualified yourself from continuing to receive the basic income grant because you have crossed these lines. You would have to, because the whole thing is based on the assumption that people will be responsible and they'll use it. And in some sense, I do think for most people who receive the basic income grant, it will be a positive force in their life, and they will use it to level up and to become healthier. But for the people that don't use it that way, it will perhaps even give them more power to be more destructive to other people. And I know that that'll see, oh, well, if you want to be a strict utilitarian and you say, well, actually, the negative is outweighed by the positive, so that doesn't matter. But this is the problem, that you end up inculcating a further culture of amorality, and amorality is really the source of evil. It's not nihilism, it's amorality. Compartmentalized amorality is really the source of the human condition, and the problem in the human condition is that when you give yourself this kind of piecemeal excuse that you can kind of allow yourself your self-indulgent belief, and I'm allowed to be unjustified in this sense. And I do think we do need in Roman culture to give people that ability. People do need to be able to self-indulge to some degree, to learn, but that we need some soft and hard structures that draw lines around this and that say, no, you are actually contributing to your own self-undoing or whatever. And so when you have a government that says, okay, well, we're willing to give a basic income grant across the board, and it's not hinged on any kind of morality testing, then you end up perversely incentivizing the further degeneration and development of amorality, which has kind of already happened to some degree in terms of the idolatry of the big government, which has kind of supplanted morality completely. Like, morality doesn't exist as a public function anymore. There's no such thing as public morality in some ways. In some ways, that has been the growth of much degeneration. And also, at the same time, more and more of the economy has become under the direct control of essentially unaccountable state structures, and you know, the state has grown in its influence over society, and it's done so by kind of de facto being the moral arbiter, which is not, which I think is the basic problem with the basic income grant at the end of the day, is that it is an affront to classical liberalism. That in some sense, I think the only way to justify a basic income grant is if you do say that some people are disqualified, that or you have to put in so many caveats that it ends up being very strange. You know, you have to, let me give an example of this. If you have a basic income grant, you have to at some point come up with two decisions. You have to say at some point, we need to not treat citizens like children. Citizens should not be reduced to infantilism and child. We should not generalize the average citizen of the state, or the citizen of the state that the state is orientating itself towards servicing and promoting the rights thereof. You cannot promote someone's rights if you conceive of them like a child. So you cannot think that the citizen is a child of the state. That is already very, very problematic and toxic, first of all. What you should rather do is you should treat the citizen as a parent, maybe a parent that needs help. But you have to, in some sense, respect the family unit. You have to empower the family, and you have to orientate your state in order to not invalidate and undercut and undermine the structure of the family and the healthy family unit, because in some sense then you are literally making it impossible for there to be an empowered sovereign citizen that is actually in command of their own life. You're making them always the child of the state, or the ward of the state. So that is just from the start, from the get-go, you have to kind of have that mentality. You have to say, how do I help parents become better parents for their children's sake, but not also in a way that I am adopting the child and stealing the child away from their parent. Because the interest of the parent, the right of the parent to choose for the child, in some sense, is something that we have to bootstrap into our structure, because otherwise we create, obviously there has to, and this is why it's so important to get the hard and soft limits of this. This is why public morality has a place, because we say, I might say, I don't agree with your parenting style, and then someone says, okay, well, let's have an argument about it, or let's try to learn about it together, or let's try to hash this out, and maybe we'll both learn something from each other. Let's do it respectfully. That is a more enlightened form of civilization, and in some sense, putting it in respect of the child is a much better way of doing this, I would say. Moving on. In respect of understanding parents and children, that we need to understand that we need to treat our citizens like would-be parents, and would-be parents that perhaps need to be helped, maybe, and ameliorated in terms of the disadvantages that they might suffer from, but it needs to be done in a respectful way, in a way that is actually empowering people and transforming their lives, not treating everyone just like a child. Obviously, some people might need emergency assistance, and especially they might need some particular help. They might need special programs that are quite far-reaching in rehabilitating people's dysfunctionality and disadvantage, if it can be fixed. Some problems perhaps cannot be fixed, and then we should not waste the resources. The government should also be careful and intelligent about the use of its resources in order to grow the base of the economy, to grow the base of the tax base, to fund even more transformative, ameliorative programs. Anyway, so I do believe in a developmental state. I do believe in a mixed economy. Anyway, moving on. This is the problem with the basic income grant, is that if you do not say you can lose your basic income grant if you act immorally, then what are people liable to perhaps do if the basic income grant is great enough? Maybe they'll create, in some sense, a whole slave caste, because they'll just say, well, in fact, I can survive on the basic income grant, so I'll just have 1 million children, and then those children will have 1 million children each. Like, you can't just do that. You have to, it's not going to be sustainable. And in some sense, when you are a beneficiary of an entitlement, you become dependent on the source of that entitlement, and then you become beholden to it, and in some sense you become a slave. At the very least, you somewhat lose your sovereignty. Now, I've painted that a bit too broadly in a principle term. Let me put it in practical terms. The problem is that perhaps you should tell people, you can keep your basic income grant if you are married and you have a child. But if you have a child out of wedlock, you lose your basic income grant. I would be okay with that. That would make the basic income grant more stomachable for me. I still think that it has problems, though. And in some sense, I still think it has insurmountable problems. Because the biggest problem is that the state should not be in the business of dictating morality to people. The state has no business to say, you don't deserve something, or you've been a naughty person because you are a single parent, and that's actually substandard. I mean, I believe, personally, I do believe it is substandard, but the state has no business endorsing moral stricture. The state has no business imposing moral stricture onto people. This is the problem. I don't want a state controlling the fucking culture. It's not the business of the state to do that. The business of the state is to guarantee my constitutional rights and to promote the access of them and to try to fix people's lives that suffer from disadvantage. I believe in a progressive tax system, is basically what I'm saying. I believe that it is justifiable to have a progressive tax system. Obviously, a progressive tax system is not being very transformative and progressive if it needs more and more resources to be more and more progressive, because its progressivism is actually not progressivism, it's promulgating disempowerment, it's promulgating dependence on the state. Then you don't live in a transformative progressive state. You live in a state of mafia thugs that say that they're giving sympathy to people, but they're actually just creating more and more of a fucking mess, which is basically what California has become in America. So, this is the corruption of sort of Democrat rule and the lowering of standards. Yes, let's have outcome-based education. Let's lower the standards so that everyone gets a higher mark, and then everything goes down a level and down a level and down a level, and where does it end? It never ends. And then you just keep on complaining, oh, look at this organization, you don't have, your quotas haven't been filled, you don't have enough people of all these different types of colors or whatever. I mean, like, it has no, it's so racist, it's so superficial, it's so uninterested in actually fixing the problems and actually repairing people's lives and making them more empowered. It's not interested in empowerment, it's interested in government control and government influence and government license and government mandates. So the government gets bigger and the real economy is smothered into nothingness, and people don't even see each other as human beings anymore. They see each other as quotas to be filled because of government mandates. They create perverse incentives that make it actually impossible for some people in small business to hire black professionals. Because if you hire a black professional, you can't retain them, because any experience you give them is going to make them a lucrative token to be bought up by a headhunting firm. And so you won't be able to retain them because you won't be able to pay them what they're worth in this perverted market. Because now the market for black professionals is unrealistic. It's not based on productivity. It's based on ideological tokenism, which has been imposed by the state. The state has imposed racialist thinking. The state has imposed racialist morality on its people, and everyone suffers. So we don't have authentic development. We don't have authentic education anymore. We just have quota-driven, sympathy-marking teachers that aren't worth their... They're not actually teaching. They are just promoting the idea of systemic oppression and promoting the idea that if you don't succeed, it's because history didn't go your way and we need to find a scapegoat to burn at the stake. It's proto-fascist bullshit, essentially. And so we've lost all composure, we've lost all structure, we've lost all fidelity in trust. We don't have trust anymore because we have this ideological trust in these disgusting categories of quotas and mandates and racialist thinking. And in some sense, this applies in many different things. This applies to the fake philosophy of scientism. That, oh yeah, the scientific method is the method of truth. No, it's not. It's a process of falsification that never ends. It's just a fucking Ponzi scheme, and they haven't developed any new scientific knowledge in the last 40 years in the deepest scientific sort of sense. They haven't made any real progress in the last 80 years. I mean, but people just say all technology is a product of science. It's not that it's the product of imagination and agency and actual people mechanically inventing things and putting things together. No, no, no. Somehow that belongs to science. So these people in white lab coats can be false authorities and use their derivative thinking, which is not the same as proving something, to pass off their conjecture and models and theory, to not properly delineate the limits of their own field, and not properly delineate the limits of their own understanding within their field, and they proffer themselves as false authorities, and the courts eat it up, they lap it up, and society and journalists laps it up, and then they create these disgusting narratives, and you end up with so much conceit. You know, I mean, the whole sort of COVID thing that I went into, I think, is a perfect example of this, where, you know, you have people that are always acting according to some proximate emergency, and they don't know the long-term damage that they're doing. They have no idea what they're doing. They're basically subjecting us all to a scientific experiment. We all become lab rats in this promulgation of, oh yeah, it would be fine to try to make us all immune to COVID. And when does that end? What is the consequences of that? This fake virtue that sympathy is always good, that maximizing sympathy is a useful way to maximize utility. I mean, this is all very corrupt thinking, and you end up undercutting people. You end up destroying the human condition and degenerating the human condition because you do not properly respect what people are in some sense. And also, you have given up the actual tool of solving the problem. I mean, South Africa is a perfect example. We have the perfect legal tradition and structure and the perfect constitution, and we have corrupt politics that have gotten away with their corruption and institutionalized their corruption into the judiciary because they have been able to proffer their and disguise their corruption in the parcel of social justice, in the parcel of identity politics. So disgusting. A complete betrayal of the constitutional values and structure of how these things are meant to be weighed by judges. But essentially the prerogative of the legislature, the prerogative of government, is essentially more important than the individual's supreme constitutional rights, that they will not even properly adjudicate over those rights, because they'll say that somehow where does it say in the Bill of Rights that the limitation can be subject to the prerogative of government? Where does it say in the limitations clause that somehow the prerogative is an important vestige that needs to be conserved? There is absolutely no mention of the prerogative in the Bill of Rights and in the limitations clause. It is utterly unjustifiable the kind of horse trading that is done around Section 9 of the Constitution, which underlines the practice of equality, not the right of equality. There is no such thing. And it's a very carefully fine-tuned thing. And when you read it properly, together with the limitations clause, you understand that an individual can stand up against the state and say that there were less restrictive means to achieve the supposed legitimate government purpose. And in fact, this whole policy is stupid. This whole policy is destructive, and it does not target disadvantage. It is a racialist policy. It is facilitating corruption and theft, and it does not even accomplish its supposed goals and aims. It's just a cover. It's just a cover for an unintelligent government that does not want to refine intelligent policy. It just wants to dictate and mandate itself into looking like the strong man, as it creates a more devastated society, a more betrayed constitution, and a more corrupted political arena where fascism every day is exalted as somehow the morally useful shortcut to solving the looming problems which are exacerbated by yet more and compounded unintelligent policy and corrupted morality and amorality to a large extent. That somehow the amorality masquerades as a technical feature that needs to be contended with. So to go back now, this I didn't make this point, but essentially was trying to semantically clarify and refine that in understanding how people are, let's say, misled and corrupted by already a corrupted culture and society, and then how they mirror that corruption within their own selves, and then how they kind of cotton on to becoming a ringleader of this kind of thing, is that they have to have, in some sense, a form of compartmentalization where they are fine with going. They know that it's rigged, but they just don't care because their people are being taken care of well enough. And in some sense, the idea is that you're getting a free lunch from sort of stealing from a scapegoat that maybe deserves it, or you can excuse the kind of the sadistic abuse or something like that. So it's a kind of compartmentalized humanity in some sense. And the idea is that, well, somehow in the fullness of history, it's balanced, it's justifiable in some narrative or something like that. Well, at the same time, they are actually inculcating a very deep form of corruption, a very deep form of moral corruption, that their soul is itself hollow and empty and is not capable of actually thinking through things anymore because they can only do narrative thinking at that point. And so when you've got this kind of narrative horse trading, you actually end up. I mean, there's a reason why I think the Nazis did almost self-destruct, why they did create wars on every side, why they went after the Russians at the same time. That they start believing in their own propaganda. They start believing in their own fatal. In some sense, they have to take more and more risks just to double down on their self-righteous kind of edge. And they get high on their own supply is basically the kind of because they are essentially drug dealers, and then they start believing in their own front men. They start believing in their own advertising and promotion of themselves, and this is the development of deep corruption. This is the institutionalized corruption, which has already stretched itself into the judiciary. I mean, the judiciary in South Africa has basically completely betrayed the constitution. They willfully subvert the constitutional values. They willfully reinterpret what things mean according to the social justice parade and charade, because it's useful, because it's convenient, because it helps one feel strong. It helps one feel, well, we don't need to grow up. We don't need to self-examine ourselves. We don't need to look at our own policy. That's not what the problem is. The problem is that you are the reason why we're not developing, because you are undermining us. You're not going with our program. You just need to follow what the government says. You just need to follow the dictates. Like, you can always just divert the pressure into a projection that no, the reason why we're failing is because capitalism is failing. It's not because we are a corrupt government and we are a corrupt judiciary that has completely betrayed the Supreme Constitution, that has completely betrayed the democratic revolution. Everything gets reframed, and there's no limit to that level of self-deception and inauthentic identity mongering. That no, you're just this identity and I'm this identity, so I get to have my beliefs and I don't have to answer to you because I'm a fucking racialist, even though the supreme law of the land is a non-racialist structure. I'm a judge and I'm allowed to mouth my racialism. I'm allowed to make speeches about this disgusting proto-fascist identity politics bullshit. I don't mind that we're being crushed between the rock and the hard place of the EFF and the ANC, latent fascism and disgusting political turmoil. So it's just this never-ending, and a lot of this has come from America, and in some sense this is the constitutional crisis that deserves to belong to America, because America has a shitty legal system. America is a 300-year-old constitution. They did their best. It's not without its charm, but it's fundamentally corrupt. It's not their fault in some sense. They even knew it when they were doing it, which is why all the rights in the Bill of Rights are in the amendment section. They're not in the body of the Constitution, because they knew that they didn't know how to make rights, constitutional rights. And they haven't made constitutional rights, because you don't have a right if it doesn't have a clear remedy attached to it. All the constitutional rights do not have clear remedies. They are political propaganda, and in some sense it's kind of like the British Compromise, that where you have almost like, in some words, the unwritten constitution of Britain, which is that the culture is alive, and in some sense in America, the rights in the Bill of Rights are just there so that politicians can use them as slogans to say, I will protect your rights, because you can only protect your political rights by voting in America through the ballot box is essentially the only way to actually safeguard and enjoy your constitutional rights, because the judge will always rationalize a legitimate government purpose as not contravening and infringing on your absolute right. That is the worthlessness of having an absolute right. It's much better to have a right that is not absolute, that has a limitations clause with objective criteria so that you can actually defend your right in court by some kind of didactic or QED, quod ed demonstrum. I can't, the Latin phrase or whatever. That is the only way that you can protect law, that you can have the rule of law, is if you have rights like that and you have a substantive law like that. But there is no pushback against the development of substantive law in America. It's whatever the legislation wants it to do, as long as it supposedly doesn't cross certain lines. And those lines are frankly not good enough now, because essentially you cannot stop corporations in America from controlling the political scene. You cannot stop the interference of election by Google, by Twitter. I mean, never mind that foreign interference. Your elections were completely denigrated by your own companies. By your own companies, you have undermined democracy. You've undermined the republic. And where is the protection? There's no protection that the Constitution really offers against that. That kind of interference, that disgusting kind of oligarchical, plutocratic interference. It's pathetic. And what does the citizenry have as a defense against that? Nothing. You cannot go to court. The only way that you could is if a state constitution or a state legislature gave you the right to go to court, to offered you the regulation that you could then depend on and litigate in court. You can only do it by the gift of the legislature, who controls your morality. Your judges are not real judges, because real judges can actually make rulings about I have to think about how to phrase this. About the substantive value and structure to the law. But in America, there is no substantive value and structure to the law, because that is by the fiat of the legislature. They are all creatures of statute in America. Judges in America are all creatures of the founding documents, the founding framing documents, the state legislature and the federal, the state constitution and the federal constitution, and then whatever other productions have been invented by the legislative houses in that particular state. And that is a substantive set of law which is not finished, that is continually updated and promulgated. It is not a general law of application, because it is prone to revision, it's prone to being changed. In principle, it is incomplete. So, because in America the law is incomplete, it's not a law of general application. It's a law of trial and error. The substantive law in America is of the quality of trial and error. So if your law is developed and the body of law is itself subject to trial and error, then you cannot have laws of general application, because the laws that are put in force in general force are applied, and then they are novated and new ones are promulgated. So you don't have laws of general application. You have laws of general force. You have an equal protection under the law of a law that is always changing. So you don't have a law of general application in that sense. You need to at least have, in principle, the law be static, and you can have legal tests that are modern updates in that. The judge should be inventing moral tests and legal tests and working out the best ones under a structure of precedent. But the substantive law itself needs to be stable. It needs to be principled, and it needs to be complete in some sense. And then you have legal tests that kind of magnify parts of that, but you need to have a law of general application. As far as I know, the only people that accomplish that is the Roman Dutch law, which doesn't even exist in Holland anymore. It only exists in my country. But the Roman Dutch law, all the actions and all the maxims are all general. You have general legal actions, and they all have criteria, and they're all based in, it's like a philosophical system. And then you can have modern legal tests that say, well, actually, maybe this one criteria doesn't fall into it anymore. And social norms and social mores are always, like, often one of the criteria in a lot of these things. And then that can mean that you can end up adding criteria because the social norms have changed on this subject, on this topic. That essentially then, that is how, let's say, the common law gets discovered around the law of general application. And that is actually the way that you have a civilized republic, a civilized society, because then you have enough of a backbone. Or, I mean, the problem in America as well is that the Constitution is badly written in the Bill of Rights. The amendments Bill of Rights, they don't have remedies attached to them. They're absolute. You can't have absolute rights. It just doesn't work, because you'll end up with some kind of rationality horse trading. And rationality is not good enough, because just because you can make a judgment that is self-consistent with its own logic does not mean that it's reasonable, does not mean that it's cogent and it's coherent. Just because you're self-consistent is not good enough. You can always conjecture some form of self-consistency to patch together some notion of why the legitimate government purpose is correct in seemingly infringing the right, but because the right is absolute, it's not seen as infringed. It's semantic bullshit. The judge is always there to rationalize the legislative fiat in some sense, with very, very limited restrictions against the legislation depending on the constitutional framing. But they are just secretaries. Judges in America are creatures of statute. They are secretaries. There are no high courts in America in this way. In this wise, there are no high courts in America. They're all creatures of statute. In some sense, even the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court of America is, in some sense, I mean, you can call it a constitutional court perhaps as well, but anyway, it's tricky. So I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to get into that can of worms, but it is slightly tricky. But they are in some sense, they are governed by the framers, and that's problematic when your framers created rights that are not clear, that do not have clear remedies attached to them. They're non-justiciable. The rights in the Bill of Rights in the American Constitution are non-justiciable. That's problematic. They're basically political rhetoric. And so maybe there is a function that the American Supreme Court can have the ability, in some sense, is a third branch of government and not just a kind of, I mean, well, certainly there's there's a constitutional crisis, and I've already outlined it. There is a fundamental constitutional crisis in America, and I'll phrase it in this other sense. The reason why the social justice warrior problem deserves to be in America is because they are, in some sense, the natural sons of liberty. And you can say, well, that's because their culture has gotten out of whack, or they want their culture. In some sense, these people just want a more refined state. They want a more refined hard power system and soft power system in their society, and they're kind of testing everything and experimenting with everything, and they realize that when they go to court and a judge rules against, if you're a social justice warrior and you go to court in America and the judge rules against you, the judge does not tell the social justice warrior, you are an immoral person, you are an unreasonable person, and I find your conduct unlawful, go away and I'm going to punish you, or you lose your action, or I will not, I'm not swayed by you, I'm not impressed by you, Mr. Social Justice Warrior. That's too bad. You're a bad person. Think about yourself. Think on yourself. The judge does not say something like that to the Social Justice Warrior. What the person, and this, look, this is a metaphor. This is a generalization, but I think I'm accurate. What they instead hear the judge saying to them, the judge says to the Social Justice Warrior, rather, I cannot do what you ask because you do not have enough political power yet. Come back when you control the legislature and I will rule in your favor. That is what the judge is saying to the social justice warrior. That is why the American system is corrupt. It's institutionally corrupt. Its legal tradition is got this kind of French Napoleonic corruption built into it in some sense. And in the same way that the French culture has this conceited impudence around itself that you must assimilate, you must be French in some sense, otherwise I don't care, you don't have a value in you. If you don't, why haven't I heard about it? If you're such a clever person, why haven't I heard about it? Why aren't you a famous French intellectual? I haven't heard about it. I haven't heard about you. Go away. In some sense, America is like that, but with its legal structure. Oh, well, have you won in court? Well, if you can't win in court, then there's obviously something wrong with your argument. Fuck off. Because the experts always get their way in court. The experts will be respected in the American legal system. Those stupid experts, because the law doesn't know how to draw the line between legal theory and expert testimony in some sense, and they can just be adopted. Because there is a kind of compunction. Look, I'm somewhat general. I'm correctly generalizing, but let me just put the caveat, or let me put the qualification on my criticism, because I do know that there are some wonderful balancing systems in the American legal system. They mainly have to do with procedural law. American procedural law is very, very good for this reason, but it's also problematic because procedure can always be abused by people that have more resources than other people. So in some sense, you cannot extract justice from a rich person in the American legal system because they will procedurally outmaneuver you. So that's a defect in some sense. But in some sense, there's a lot of very fine thinking that's gone into the due process. America is a due process system, but that's not good enough for that's not good enough for the rule of law. So actually what it boils down to is America does not have the rule of law. It has the rule of man. And you can see this very clearly in how people squabble and fight over the legislative seats of power, because the legislative seats of power promulgate the morality in America, because there is no sovereign citizen in America. You are sovereign against the state. You can say, the state, stop encroaching on me with your hard power, but the state can still corrupt you as much as they so wish with their soft power and with their soft legislative devices that they have, in some sense, the American system would have stayed good enough if government had stayed small. But the Democrats essentially won that battle, and they also contracted the judiciary. You're allowed to create legislation in America that says you can't sue people for, that it was by legislative and even now probably federal legislation that you can't sue companies about pollution. It has to go through some government institutional organization. So you never developed the judicial the judicial muscles that should have grown so that you could actually have an individually driven society that had real classical liberal values baked into it. All those classical liberal values were inoculated and vaccinated against by these hard institutional substitutions of let's say the, you know, I mean, as soon as you can no longer, or I don't know if this is true or not, but I mean, it used to be a beautiful tradition in the American legal system that if you did not have a remedy, you would sue the post office for providing a remedy for this problem, for this legal conundrum or something like that. So you would always sue the post office in some sense in the alternative if you're trying to kind of make new law or make provision or develop a law of general application that has gone wanting. This is a bit complicated, but I mean that's and in some sense that has now been turned off. I've heard from little birds or whatever. Maybe it's not true, but I've been told that essentially you're not allowed to sue the post office anymore. Or I mean, I guess I'm this is secondhand information, so I mean I would have to see this for myself to some degree. But the legal structure in America, I think, has waned in its. I don't even know if I'm saying the right thing. It's waning when it gets smaller. I believe it waning is when it gets smaller, but the light of reason in the American constitutional system is being eclipsed by what is a de facto constitutional crisis. And it is manifest on the political sphere, it's manifest on the cultural sphere, and it is certainly imprinted in the legal moralism of the day, as it were. I mean, I would link this conceptually to Lord Sumption's Reith lectures on law's expanding empire and such, although I gave my own critique on Lord Sumption's Reith lectures because I believe that there's a higher, more nuanced synthesis to be made when you contrast, because I mean Britain has its you can't really replicate the British system because it's so ephemeral. It's so, in some sense, it's a living, breathing sort of cultural compromise and cultural institutional. The institution is a kind of cultural entrenched program, whereas South Africa, in some sense, is, I think, the correct solution to America's problem, in some sense, although it's kind of hard to see that because to some degree it's America's fault that we can't see that, because it was the American culture and its corrupted journalism that spilled over, and its corrupted academia as well, that spilled over into that spilled over into South Africa. We got your race and gender studies professors in our universities preaching their disgusting fascistic racialism and proto-fascism and legal positivism, just like the Nazis were legal positivists, by the way. You know, and we also suffer from, you know, the siren call, the blaring siren call of the American cultural mess, which gets broadcast all over the world. But more specifically, our judiciary was misled, and I know for a fact that they took advice from American legal scholars who have no fucking clue what they're doing in South Africa. They have no fucking clue what the South African legal tradition and system is like, and there they are explaining government prerogative. Keep your fucking filthy legal corruption to yourself with your constitutional crisis which you deserve. Fix your own fucking house before you come here and you mislead other people and you corrupt a whole system that was fucking superior to your system. Look, I do. Let me just retrace that a little bit, because in some sense we do stand on your shoulders. The development of the South African legal tradition and also the development of the South African Constitution, which is in some sense was only created in 1993, we have to understand is standing on the shoulders of the American example. So let me not be ungrateful to history. Let me not be an ingrate and say that America rebelled too early from King George, and King George was somewhat right to say that it was too soon, and in some sense that he was not in the midst of his own development of politics, of his municipal politics. I mean, in some sense, the reason why America divorced from the British Empire was because King George was having a spat with his own parliament, and he was trying to get people to kind of create a government of national unity. He wanted the best people of each party to come together to make the best possible governance, and the parliament quite rightly wanted to develop their own organic politics. They wanted to develop their own organic party politics, and they were kind of using the colonies in some sense to kind of maybe get King George off their back, but also that's what parliaments do. They're greedy. I mean, what is an empire doing with a parliament? With colonies? What is a parliament doing with colonies? You know, it's kind of it's a bit of a furor. You know, it's a bit of a catastrophe waiting to happen. I mean, so obviously people, if they're given the option, you know, are going to exploit other people in some sense. But if they are, in some sense, if they, in terms of because the national distinction is that, well, this is not these are not different nations. This is an empire. You know, what is a parliament doing in an empire? You know, so in some sense, the problem between America and the parliament in Britain, which was taxing it, was in some way I mean, this is a hard thing to say. You know, well, it's not an eloquent thing to say, but essentially, you know, was essentially the problem with the nature of nationhood itself, the problem with the nature of nationality. In some sense, it was a historical meditation on the moral nature and also the utility of moral of national distinctiveness, of national boundaries, of how morality and nationhood, and in some sense America is to some degree a product of both history but also a product of that particular conflict, that it resolved that conflict for itself. Anyway, I don't want to get into too much esoteric thematic expounding on these sorts of things, but let me find another synthesis here. Because that is a bit of a rabbit hole which I could go down, and it is a little bit interesting, but it's a bit too abstract from the prescient points that is worth making and emphasizing as the actual salient and underlined topic of our day. Is that perhaps, and I know that this is not a justifiable demand to make, but perhaps what America should have done is, instead of rebelling, look, I'm not giving this as an actual counterfactual. I don't care for historical counterfactuals. I'm doing this as a thought experiment, as a way to understand the moral precondition of the American enterprise, the moral context, and perhaps the shadows of amorality that need to leave no stone unturned. That as a thought experiment, what America perhaps should have done instead of rebelling is that it should have said, look at how King George is troubled by his own parliament. Look at how the parliament in Britain is unjust. Let us speak on this. Let us not even foment revolution, but let us morally explore this as a scholarly class, as philosopher kings, as sovereign individuals in a colony that wish to be free of this kind of tyranny, which we despise, but we will not be rebellious. But we will instead be intellectually rebellious and be intellectually explorative, and let us create let us have a war of words in some sense about this. Let us expand into this, and then let us see how repressive this parliament might be. Will this parliament try to suppress our intellectual forthrightness? Will they try to suppress our authentic and genuine interrogation of their injustice? And perhaps if they took it on that approach, there would have been a greater political treatise that would have perhaps prevented Cromwell. If I've got the history right, I don't actually know if Cromwell happened. I presume Cromwell happened afterwards, but who knows? Or was Cromwell? See, I'm so historically uninformed. But in some sense, maybe Britain then would have come up. I do actually say this about Britain. Britain often says about itself in the 1960s that after the Second World War, it was generally regarded that Britain has lost its role in the world after it lost its empire. I disagree. I believe Britain, in some sense, lost its role in the world, or that it was destined to lose its role in the world when America rebelled against it. Because then the project of the British Empire was somewhat shattered, and it was in a process of devolution ever since then, I would even say. And I even link essentially the penal colonies in Australia to this, because they lost faith in their own justice system. Because if they... Anyway. I explored that in my last recording, the interesting parallel perhaps between the penal colony in Australia and the American Revolution, which I don't even know if my history is correct in that. Was Australia established after the American Revolution or before as a penal colony? Anyway, you see, I'm so historically uninformed. But to me, it's not that important, because I'm just taking it as a thought experiment, as a thematic way of exploring these issues. But in some sense, I think that both Britain and America were both impoverished by not fully imbibing the historical lesson that was overrun by the conflagration of overt war, the war for independence, and actual violent hostility between, within the empire and the burgeoning new independent nation. That in some sense that whole event covered over a conundrum, which was, the role of a parliament in some sense. And I think America is this premature development that didn't know what it was doing, because it was rebelling not against King George. In some sense, it was rebelling against the parliament. And so they were rebelling against, you must remember that in Britain, the parliament is sovereign, and America basically copied that model. And I think that was the missing lesson in history. I mean, the British Parliament is still sovereign, and it still functions. I think it functions well enough for Britain, in some sense, partly because of the... In some sense, the American Revolution was also perhaps a resolution. It was a cultural resolution to that stalemate, because after Britain lost the American War of Independence, it was in some sense a cultural censure and a cultural rebuke against the British sovereign parliament. And that is a problem, because that's a cultural teaching, but it was never embodied in a hard power structure. It was never inculcated into a, it was a lesson learned, but it was not understood. It was not fully understood. It was not justifiably encapsulated into a sensibility, and you can call it maybe the classical liberal sovereign nobility of... Sorry, I said a bit too many words there, but it is something like the tradition of British political liberalism. But a British political liberalism that is very hard to ground in other countries, because you don't know what it's missing, because it's missing the history, because it doesn't have a full representation of its structure, except for my country does have. The Fire Nation, the South African howling dog, is, or howling wolf perhaps, or howling fox, who knows? That's what the country looks like. Have you seen the eye of the howling fox, perhaps? And who was South Africa? I mean, we were a small way station of the Dutch, a small colony of the Dutch in the corner of the Western Cape. We developed uh, our Dutch Roman law. We got a lot of European people that were escaping the Inquisition in Europe. Got other people also that immigrated here from Europe. The British came and took over when their empire, and the British kept the Roman Dutch law because they knew it was better than their law, and they don't fix things that aren't broken. But they did replace the procedural law in our country, and they did, in some sense, encapsulate everything within the common law. So we actually have this wonderful mix as well. And then we have the politics, and the history of this country, and in some sense, there was, I mean, there are different groups of Europeans in this country um, that developed their own. Anyway, I mean, I can't that competently talk about the history of this country. I know about the history of the Western Cape more so than about the history of the country. In some sense, a lot of it is a battle between the British and the German and the Dutch descendants, the Afrikaner nation that went up to make their own nation, and then the British went after them because they discovered diamonds. When diamonds were found in Kimberley, which were essentially, I think, discovered there after the establishment of the Transvaal and such. And then also, you have the kind of hostility that happened between the other empires and nations in this country. The Zulu nation, the Xhosa nation, between the people that trekked north, uh, and also, I mean, I guess even the British. I mean, the British went to war against the Zulu nation as well, and that was quite a bloody war as well, on both sides, I believe. Um, I think that was a war that wasn't even won by the British. I think it was kind of almost like stalemated or something. Um, and I must say, I don't know about all the hostilities in the country. It's certainly, I've never been that much of a student of history, but I do roughly know some of the general sort of forms of it. But obviously, Russia had a lot to do with the development of this country in some way because, well, the apartheid government was definitely against communism, which was why some of the wars happened in sub-Saharan Africa. Um, but also, essentially, a lot of intellectuals were educated in Russia, black intellectuals, freedom fighters, that were um, trained with military training, but also trained intellectually in Russia. And also there were other people who lived in exile, you know, princes and intellectual elites and freedom fighters that were educated in America, that were educated in Britain, educated in universities all over the world. I mean, also a lot of black people were educated in South Africa. I mean, there were universities that were designated, because everything was segregated, uh, for Bantu-speaking peoples. There were law schools. I mean, Nelson Mandela was himself a lawyer and was legally trained. You know, and there was also some good education in this country, usually through, I mean, for example, Nelson Mandela himself, he was educated in a Catholic school. So there's always been a mixed bag of a mixed experience in the South African context, and in some sense it's also incredibly different, because the Western Cape is very different from the rest of the country. Has a different history, is a much older history, at least in terms of the European influence and the European mixture of in history, which centers around Cape Town and the Cape. And it's interesting, you know, when you grow up in a place, when you have history, when your ancestors have history in a place, you know, in some sense, it gets in your blood. Being in a place gets in your blood. But we also, you know, can't confine ourselves to defining ourselves through our history. I mean, everything changes. Things fall apart, especially when there's no common spirit or goodwill or good hope or good faith. When you miss these basic ingredients, things certainly fall apart. And then, you know, I mean, famously, things fell apart in Weimar Germany. I mean, they just killed the people who spoke out against the proto-fascists and the proto-fascist philosophers. I mean, the level of intellectualism that rallied against the fascistic scourge and the moral corruption, and even also that because they had to speak against, I mean, it was, fascism really amalgamated itself with social, I mean, fascism has always often defined itself as collectivist, as socialistic. Nazi literally stands for the German Workers' Socialist Party. So fascism is a socialism. It defines itself as being a workers' party, and it defines itself as being socialistic. National Social German Workers' Party. It's interesting. National. The only way to get around this is to have a justice system that is based on clearly delineated values, principles, the rule of law, which actually has two requirements: a law of general application that has objective criteria, and equal protection under the law in terms of the administration of it. Or the equal protection under the law is a bit of a that needs to be expounded on, because it's a bit ambiguous in some senses. Equal protection under the law. That doesn't mean equal protection of the law as a whole. There's, after you have laws of general application, you have equal protection underneath the subjection to that law. So that doesn't mean that some people can't, in some sense, use the law better than other people. That doesn't mean that everyone must have the same outcome from utilization of the law. Equal protection under the objective criteria and the general application of law that exists as a full body in some sense. You know, this is the kind of nuance which is lost on people who think that equality is a right. Equality is not a right, it's a practice. Anyway, let me stop this babbling now, but probably tired myself out, but yeah, anyway, I guess that's all of it on this kind of topic. I guess my next recording will be on more directly about trying to advise to men, and perhaps both sexes as well, but at least a model of how to kind of, in my view, and this might not be appropriate for all personality types as well, but I will try to talk about sex, the issue of sex and sexuality, and a model. And in some sense, you can't do this in a very definitive. I mean, I can't do this as a prescription. I mean, all I can do is say, I think this is a good model. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I need to take more things into account. But I will try to give what I consider to be, in my experience, which is perhaps a very peculiar and particular experience as well. But I will try to create a general convention. I'll try to model a conventional way of, ideally in some sense, or at least what the default, a proposition of what a default sexual marketplace of people that deliberate and decide how they want to interact with one another within that sexual marketplace, how I will try to delineate some models and some structures that I think are useful and will perhaps lead to better outcomes. But obviously these things have to, you can't get involved in anything by prescription. You have to do it under your own, in some sense, I would say, especially in very delicate, intimate matters. You have to do it under your own steam of your own responsibility, because otherwise it's, you're not even going to be yourself as you're doing it in some sense. Which is very, very toxic, because in some sense you know that you can just, if anything goes wrong, you can just blame the person who gave you the advice or something like that. So in some sense that's the problem of just sort of freely giving advice to people. The kind of the toxic thing that even starts to create this kind of sympathy borderline chain of self-deception and unsustainability and scapegoating and such. Anyway,